That afternoon at the Detroit Independent Auto Expo, Giselle stood at the center of a loose circle of reporters and smiled, the kind of smile that belonged to someone who had never needed to look up. In front of her sat a dusty, dented Ford F-150 with an exposed fuel system built from copper tubing and salvaged industrial valves. The man standing beside it, Owen, wore no company badge, carried no business cards, and had no investor standing behind him. She looked at the camera and said, clearly and without hesitation, that what she saw in front of her could blow an engine, not improve one. 24 hours later, the numbers from an independent testing facility arrived, and that smile disappeared entirely. What makes a discarded engineer outperform an entire corporation? The answer lived in 3 years inside a garage. The garage Owen rented on the outer edge of Detroit's western industrial corridor had no air conditioning, no natural light worth mentioning, and a concrete floor that had absorbed decades of motor oil into something close to permanent stain. He had been working in it since a Tuesday morning in the spring 3 years earlier when he walked out of NextDrive Motors with a cardboard box under one arm and nothing in the other. The single overhead bulb cast everything in the color of old amber, and by the time Owen arrived each morning the space already smelled of copper flux, machine lubricant, and the specific burnt plastic scent that came from insulation tape being stripped by hand instead of with a tool. Carter, his oldest friend from a decade of shared shop floors, sat on an overturned crate near the door most mornings with a paper cup of coffee and the quiet patience of a man who had decided long ago that Owen was worth believing in even when the evidence was still being assembled. On the morning that mattered, Carter did not say much. He watched Owen move along the driver's side of the F-150 with the focused economical gestures of someone conducting a final inspection that was not really about doubt. It was about respect for the work itself. The system mounted inside that engine bay did not look like money. That was the first thing anyone noticed, and for most people it was also the last thing they processed before walking away. Sections of heavy-gauge copper tubing ran in clean parallel lines from a modified intake manifold to a pair of custom pressure regulators that Owen had machined himself from salvaged valve bodies sourced from an industrial HVAC auction 2 years earlier. Between them, a small mechanical actuator, hand-fitted into a bracket that had originally belonged to a mid-90s agricultural sensor housing, linked the pressure regulation circuit to a vibration-reading collar mounted directly on the engine block above the second cylinder. It looked improvised, it was not. Every weld joint, every compression fitting, every millimeter of tolerancing in that system had been calculated, tested, discarded, recalculated, and rebuilt. Owen ran his thumb along the lower pressure line the way a luthier might run a thumb along a seam, not checking for failure but verifying presence. The system was whole, it had always been whole. He had just needed the world to be ready to look at it. 3 years earlier, Owen had been the lead engineer on a fuel efficiency research team inside NextDrive's Advanced Propulsion Division. He had spent 26 months developing an adaptive fuel distribution model built around a key insight that the industry had consistently overlooked. Most modern injection systems optimized for instantaneous load conditions, but load itself was not instantaneous. It was cyclical, predictable in short windows, and the combustion chamber knew it before the ECU did. Owen's approach used integrated thermal and mechanical sensors to read that cycle in real time and adjust fuel delivery fractionally ahead of the curve rather than reactively behind it. The lab numbers he recorded in the autumn of his second year at NextDrive were 31% better than the OEM baseline on the same engine family. He submitted a proposal to present to the engineering board in the spring. He never got the meeting. Before the calendar could turn, Jason, the division's chief engineer, and the man whose name appeared at the top of every departmental report regardless of authorship, filed an internal performance review citing Owen for unauthorized data sharing with an unnamed external party. The charge was vague enough to be unfalsifiable. The HR process that followed lasted 11 days. Owen's badge was deactivated on a Wednesday. He did not sign anything admitting wrongdoing because there was nothing to admit. He simply left, carrying the one thing no termination letter could confiscate: the knowledge of exactly what he had built and exactly why it worked. The system in the F-150 was not a copy of what he had designed at NextDrive. Owen had started over from a different angle entirely, not because he was legally cautious, but because 3 years of working alone in amber light had taken him somewhere further than the original design had ever reached. The new architecture used mechanical-electronic integration rather than software-dependent sensor fusion. It was cheaper by an order of magnitude, required no proprietary chipsets, and was serviceable with standard tooling. The vibration reading collar on the block was the heart of the system. It read combustion resonance patterns 60 times per second and fed that data to the mechanical actuator, which adjusted the pressure differential across the injection circuit before the next cycle opened. No learning algorithm, no cloud connectivity, no firmware updates. Just physics, applied with precision and patience. When Carter had first seen Owen's handwritten data from a solo test run on an empty industrial road outside the city, he had held the notebook for a long time without speaking. The numbers written there, ranging from 38 to 42% improvement over baseline, were not the kind of numbers that fit easily into existing categories. Carter had eventually put the notebook down, picked up his coffee, and said quietly that Owen needed to be careful. Owen had said he intended to be exactly that. On the morning of the expo, Carter asked him one last time whether he was certain he wanted to take the truck there, given that the Detroit Independent Auto Expo drew press, and press meant NextDrive would hear about it within hours. Owen had closed the hood of the F-150 with both hands evenly and looked at his friend with something that was not quite a smile but was in the neighborhood of one. He said that was precisely the reason. 31 floors above street level, in a glass-fronted conference room that looked out over the same Detroit skyline, Owen could sometimes see from his garage roof on clear evenings, Giselle was conducting a quarterly review in the manner she conducted all quarterly reviews. Standing at the front of the room, posture straight, one hand resting on the edge of the credenza behind her, voice flat and precise as a surveyor's line. She was 31 years old and had been CEO of NextDrive Motors for 2.5 years. She had not inherited the position and had not been handed it through connections or tenure. She had been brought in when the company was 18 months from a creditor's event and had rebuilt the cost structure from the division level up, cutting 3 programs that were bleeding cash and protecting 2 that were generating the kind of data the board needed to see. The board had rewarded her with full operational authority and the kind of institutional loyalty that tended to follow results. She wore a gray suit and had her hair pinned back and did not use notes because she had read every page of the reports before entering the room. The people sitting at the table knew this about her, and it made them careful. The presentation that morning was the 18-month progress report on Project Prometheus, NextDrive's flagship internal fuel efficiency initiative, funded to the sum of $47 million across the research and development division. Jason presented it himself, standing with the ease of a man who had been in that room for nearly a decade and had long since stopped being nervous about anything that happened inside it. The headline number he offered was 27% improvement over the baseline, measured under controlled laboratory conditions. He explained this represented a meaningful step forward for the industry. He used the phrase ahead of segment benchmarks twice. Giselle listened. She noted, though she did not say so aloud, that the laboratory figure of 27% diverged from the real-world field test average by nearly 8 percentage points. The field numbers consistently landed between 19 and 21%. She had seen this gap in the supplemental appendix. She had not asked about it during the review because she had, until that morning, attributed it to the normal friction between controlled conditions and road variables. She filed it in the part of her mind where unresolved items waited and moved on to the next agenda item. Jason did not volunteer an explanation for the gap. That, too, she noted without speaking. The invitation to attend the Detroit Independent Auto Expo had been sitting in her calendar for 2 weeks, flagged as optional. Her communications team flagged it again that afternoon, noting that NextDrive had been invited for 3 consecutive years and had never sent a representative, and that several trade publications had begun including the absence as a footnote when writing about the company's public engagement posture. Giselle approved a half-day attendance. She would appear, speak to a few people, let the cameras take their pictures, and return to the building by 2 in the afternoon. It was not a strategic decision. It was a maintenance task. Before she left the office that evening, Jason stopped by her desk with the loose, unhurried step of a man delivering afterthoughts. He mentioned in the tone of someone covering a procedural detail that if anyone at the expo brought up the name Owen Marsh, a former NextDrive engineer, the appropriate response was simply that the matter had been handled through proper HR channels. Giselle looked up from her screen. She asked if Owen Marsh was going to be there. Jason said he doubted it and that it was just a precaution. He left before she could ask a follow-up question. That night, alone in her apartment, she did not think about Owen Marsh at all. Diana had been writing about automotive and mechanical engineering for 7 years, first for a trade publication that covered the commercial fleet sector, then independently for 2 technical magazines and a small number of institutional clients who valued clean, sourced reporting over narrative speculation. She was 30 years old and operated out of a home office in Ann Arbor with a filing system that anyone else would have called chaotic, and that she called indexed by intuition. 2 days before the expo, she received a message through her professional contact form. It contained no name, no organization, and no explanation. It said only that Owen Marsh would be demonstrating something worth seeing at the Detroit Independent Auto Expo, and that she should bring measurement equipment. She knew the name Owen Marsh because 3 years earlier she had attempted to interview him following the news of his termination from NextDrive. A story that had registered only briefly in the trade press before disappearing entirely, as employment disputes at mid-sized automotive companies tended to do. He had declined the interview. He had not been rude about it. He had simply said he had nothing useful to offer at that time, and the call had ended. She had noted in her records that he sounded like someone who was not finished yet. The anonymous message arrived on a Tuesday evening. By Wednesday morning, she had confirmed her attendance at the expo and placed her OBD2 diagnostic reader in her bag alongside the recorder and 2 fresh batteries. The Detroit Independent Auto Expo occupied a converted freight warehouse in the Eastern Industrial District, a vast single-floor space with high ceilings, painted concrete floors, and row lighting that flickered slightly in the far northeast corner. Attendance ran to several hundred people across the 2-day event: engineers, independent fabricators, small-run component manufacturers, and the particular subset of automotive enthusiasts who read technical specifications the way other people read novels. There were no elevated platforms, no theatrical lighting rigs, no sponsor banners across every available surface. The booths were tables and parking spots, and the conversations happening between them were the kind that required genuine knowledge to participate in. Owen had parked the F-150 near the interior wall at the back of the building, away from the main entrance foot traffic. Carter had rigged a simple hand-painted board to the side of the truck bed: adaptive fuel distribution system, field test unit open for inspection, no logo, no company name. No contact information below it. Owen stood beside the open hood and answered questions when people approached, which they did with increasing frequency as the morning moved toward midday, because word traveled in that building the way it traveled anywhere that technical people congregated. Through a chain of nudged elbows and lowered voices and the specific phrase, repeated more than once that morning, that there was something worth looking at in the back corner. Giselle arrived at 11:15 with a communications associate and 2 members of her public relations team. She was dressed for a public appearance, not a technical evaluation, and she moved through the building with the practiced efficiency of someone executing a schedule. She shook hands, accepted a few business cards, allowed photographs near the entrance display. The visit was proceeding exactly as she had planned it. Then, from somewhere across the warehouse floor, she heard the phrase 40% from the mouth of a man she did not recognize, and she turned instinctively toward the sound the way anyone trained to track numbers does. She navigated through the mid-floor crowd to the back corner and arrived at the edge of the small gathering around the F-150. The moment she registered Owen's face across the hood of the truck, something passed behind her expression, a compression of something she was not immediately able to name. She recognized him from the single photograph attached to the internal HR file she had pulled up briefly the evening Jason had mentioned his name. She had not looked at that file for long. She looked at it now in the form of the actual man, standing in front of a truck with an exposed system made of copper pipe and reclaimed fittings, and a quiet confidence that she found, in that moment, more unsettling than she expected. A reporter near the front of the small crowd recognized Giselle and moved toward her with a recorder. The question came immediately: what did she make of the fuel system on display, given that the man behind it was claiming 40% real-world improvement? She looked at Owen. She looked at the truck. She looked at the exposed system, the copper lines, the salvaged valve bodies, the hand-machined brackets, and she let one beat of silence pass before she answered. She said that NextDrive had invested close to $50 million and more than 2 years of institutional engineering talent into advancing fuel efficiency, and that she respected individual passion projects in every form. Then she let her eyes travel briefly but visibly toward the system itself, and she said, with the measured clarity of someone who believed completely in what they were saying, that what she saw in front of her was more likely to blow an engine than improve one. The reporters wrote it down. The cameras caught the angle of her glance. It was a clean, confident dismissal, delivered without cruelty and with total conviction, and it landed in the room the way she had intended, as the authoritative last word on the matter. Owen did not respond. He did not look at the camera, did not raise his voice, did not adjust his posture or his expression in any way that suggested he had been struck by what she said. He turned back to the engineer he had been speaking with before Giselle arrived and continued explaining the pressure differential calibration sequence at the point where the question had interrupted them. That stillness, not submission, not performance, just the untroubled resumption of what had been interrupted, was the detail that Diana, standing at the edge of the gathering with her recorder already running, noted above everything else. When the crowd loosened and Giselle's group moved away, Diana walked forward and asked Owen a direct question: whether he would allow an independent measurement using her OBD2 diagnostic reader here now, before the day ended. Owen looked at her for a moment. He asked who she was. She told him. He considered this for no more than 3 seconds and then said yes, and turned to Carter, who was already walking toward the driver's side door. The parking area behind the warehouse connected to a stretch of 2-lane service road that ran east along the edge of the freight district for about 1.5 miles before looping back through a series of light industrial blocks with 2 shallow grades and 1 longer flat section. It was not a controlled testing environment. That was, in one sense, its value. Diana ran the F-150 through 3 full circuits of that route with Owen's OBD2 port occupied by her reader and Carter keeping handwritten notes in the passenger seat while Owen stood outside on the loading dock and watched through the chain-link fence. He did not ask to ride along. He did not instruct Diana on how to drive. He had nothing to manage in that moment because the system either worked or it did not. And he had already answered that question for himself hundreds of times on hundreds of different road segments over 32 months in this city and 2 others. The first circuit produced a figure of 37.8% improvement over the baseline stored in the truck's ECU as the pre-installation reference measurement. The second circuit, which included the longer flat section at sustained moderate throttle, read 39.2. The third circuit, which Diana ran at a slightly higher average load with both shallow grades taken without coasting, returned 41.6. She parked the truck, sat for a moment without getting out, and looked at the 3 numbers on the reader's screen with the expression of someone deciding how much trust to extend to what they were seeing. She knew an OBD2 reader had limitations. She also knew it could not be made to lie by 38 to 42 percentage points in any direction that she was aware of. She got out of the truck and walked back to Owen and asked him to explain the core operating principle, not the engineering specification, but the actual logic of how it worked in plain language. He explained it without abbreviating and without inflating. Most fuel injection systems, he said, corrected for load after the fact. The engine demanded, the system responded, the next cycle was adjusted. The gap between demand and response was small in absolute terms but consistent and cumulative across thousands of cycles per minute. His system read combustion vibration patterns at the block, specific resonance signatures that preceded the next load state by a predictable interval, and used that reading to adjust fuel delivery before the cycle rather than during it. The mechanical actuator translated that information into a physical pressure differential change across the injection circuit without requiring any software layer between the sensor input and the physical output. No firmware, no wireless signal, no dependency on a processor that could be updated or corrupted or discontinued. Diana asked why he had used reclaimed components. Owen said that if a system only functioned with $10,000 proprietary parts, it was not a solution. It was a proof of concept that would never leave the lab. He had built this to be manufactured at scale for the cost of agricultural equipment, not aerospace equipment. Diana asked about NextDrive. Owen was quiet for a moment that was not uncomfortable but was clearly weighted. Then he said he had left NextDrive in the spring 3 years earlier and that the circumstances were documented in the company's HR records and that he had nothing useful to add to what was already on file. His voice did not change temperature when he said it. Diana did not press further that afternoon. What she did do 40 minutes later was call the director of Tech Verify, an independent vehicle performance certification laboratory in Ann Arbor that held accreditation from 3 federal agencies and whose measurements had been admitted as evidence in 2 separate automotive patent disputes, and request a formal test lot. The director told her the next available appointment was in 48 hours. She said she would take it and that she would personally cover the certification fee. Owen agreed to the Tech Verify test without negotiating the terms. He said only that he wanted no representatives from any major automotive manufacturer in the facility during the test, and that the results should be released simultaneously to all parties rather than given to any single party first. Diana agreed to both conditions. On the drive back across the city that evening, Carter asked Owen whether he was ready for what came after the numbers. Owen looked out the passenger window at the last light sitting on the river and said he had been ready for 3 years. Carter did not argue with that. Tech Verify occupied a low-profile building off a secondary access road outside Ann Arbor, distinguished from its neighbors only by the array of sensor mounting posts in the rear lot and the calibrated dynamometer bay visible through the roll-up door at the east end of the building. The facility's lead certification engineer ran a standard pre-test inspection that lasted just over 2 hours and covered every system in the F-150 from the fuel tank forward, documenting the presence and configuration of Owen's adaptive distribution system and confirming that no modification had been made to the engine block, fuel injectors, exhaust system, or ECU baseline calibration. Owen stepped outside during inspection. Carter had brought a thermos and 2 cups. Neither of them spoke very much. The formal test protocol comprised 3 sequential cycles run on the facility's chassis dynamometer, an urban drive simulation, a highway steady-state run, and a combined mixed-load cycle that included simulated grade ascent under load. Each cycle was run twice with a full cooldown interval between runs to eliminate heat-soak variables. The OEM baseline for the same engine family, a 6.2-liter naturally aspirated unit, had been certified by the facility the previous year as part of an unrelated fleet evaluation and was on record in their system. The comparison would be made against that certified baseline, not against Owen's own pre-installation reference. The urban cycle results came back first, 38.4% improvement over the certified OEM baseline. The lead engineer, a careful man who had spent 19 years in emissions and efficiency certification and was not given to visible reactions, looked at the figure on his screen and ran the input data validation before writing anything down. The highway cycle returned 36.1%. The mixed-load cycle with grade simulation returned 43.7%. The weighted composite figure, calculated according to the EPA methodology, was 39.8%. The engineer ran both cycles a second time. The composite figure from the second run was 39.6%, within the normal repeatability margin. He looked at Owen when he came back inside to give the results in person, and he said something he rarely said in a professional context. That he would need the second confirmation run on record, not because he questioned the outcome, but because any result of this magnitude would be questioned by others, and he wanted the documentation to be clean. Owen said he understood completely. He shook hands with everyone in the facility. He thanked the engineer by name. Diana held the signed certification report in both hands in the parking lot outside Tech Verify, reading it a second time not because she had misread it the first time but because she was making the decision in real time about what kind of story this was and what it obligated her to do. She was a careful writer and a precise one. She drove back to Ann Arbor, sat at her desk, and wrote for 3 hours. The article she filed to her primary technical publication that evening contained the methodology, the facility name, the lead engineer's name and credentials, the baseline comparison source, the composite figure of 39.8%, and a single line of context noting that the system's designer was a former NextDrive engineer. She did not characterize Giselle's remarks at the expo as an attack. She did not describe Owen as a hero. She presented the numbers with the same flat neutrality she used for every certification result she had ever written about, because she had learned long ago that accurate numbers, presented cleanly, required no assistance from the writer. The article moved quickly through technical engineering networks that evening. Within 6 hours, it had been referenced in 3 industry forums and picked up by 2 broader technology publications. The question that began appearing in those secondary discussions was not hostile or sensationalized. It was simply the question that the data made unavoidable. If $47 million in 18 months of institutional engineering had produced a real-world improvement of 19 to 21%, and a single independent engineer working in a rented garage had produced 39.8%, what explained the difference? No one in those discussions had an answer yet. But the question, once asked, did not go away. Jason saw the article at 9:40 that evening, forwarded to him by a junior member of the communications team who had been monitoring trade press mentions of NextDrive. He read it twice. Then he sat at his kitchen table for a while in the quiet and thought about a calculation that had nothing to do with fuel efficiency. The following morning, a competing technical publication received background briefing from an unnamed source close to NextDrive's engineering division, suggesting that Owen Marsh had been terminated for using proprietary company data without authorization, and that the system he was currently demonstrating was built on intellectual property that did not belong to him. The article ran 36 hours after Diana's piece. It did not name the source. It did not include a comment from Owen. It described his original termination in terms that implied guilt without stating it directly, which was the precise legal distance required to print it without attribution. Owen read the counter-article the evening it was published alone in the garage. He did not post a response anywhere. He did not call a lawyer that night. He walked to his workbench, opened the bottom drawer, and removed a folder he had kept in that drawer for 30 months without touching it. Inside were printed email threads from his time at NextDrive, dated, server-stamped, and in several cases showing exchange headers that included both his account and Jason's. There were handwritten data logs with date stamps predating Jason's internal submission by 4 months. And there was a screenshot of his original modeling spreadsheet, captured on a company workstation and timestamped by the server at 10:17 on a Thursday morning in the second year of his employment, 14 weeks before Jason filed his report. Owen had not collected this material as a weapon. He had collected it because he was an engineer and engineers documented their work, and because some part of him had understood, on the morning he walked out of NextDrive with that cardboard box, that documentation was the only form of memory that could not be rewritten by someone with a better title. Carter was the one who had sent Diana the data file. He had not told Owen. He had copied the relevant documents to a compressed folder from Owen's external drive one afternoon 3 weeks before the expo, when Owen had been outside in the alley checking a replacement fitting, and he had sent it from a free mail account to Diana's professional contact address with no name attached. He told himself it was support. He also knew it was the kind of support that works best when it operates without permission. The NextDrive board did not call an emergency session. What happened was quieter and more serious than that. The chairman sent individual messages to 4 board members requesting a working group call, and that call happened the morning after Diana's article had cleared 100,000 total views across all the publications that had run it. Giselle attended the call from her office with the door closed and the blinds angled down. The questions from the board were not accusatory. They were the questions of people who had spent their professional lives managing institutional risk and who recognized, in the tone of what they were reading, the particular shape of a problem that did not resolve itself. The chairman asked her one question directly and plainly. Was there genuine legal exposure here? Giselle told him she was currently assessing that. She was not yet able to tell him no. The internal inquiry she initiated the same afternoon was conducted by NextDrive's in-house legal team with an outside employment attorney present as observer. Jason came in, dressed the same way he always dressed, the calm of someone who had been in that building longer than most of the people asking him questions. He answered everything asked of him. He was articulate, consistent, and detailed. He did not look at Giselle when he answered the questions about Owen's original work. That was the only thing that broke the surface of his composure, and Giselle noticed it because she noticed everything, and because she had spent 3 hours the night before reading Owen's personnel file in full for the first time. Not just the termination summary but the original project documentation, the submission timestamps, the internal routing records, and the single line in the HR narrative that identified Jason as the sole witness to the alleged data-sharing violation. There was no second witness. There was no digital forensic record of the alleged external transmission. There was only Jason's written statement and the HR administrator's signature, and the HR administrator had left NextDrive 14 months after the termination. Giselle called Owen directly. She had gotten his number from the inquiry file. He picked up after 3 rings. She told him she wanted to meet, not as a representative of NextDrive, not with counsel present, not on the record. She said she was asking for herself. Owen was silent for 5 seconds. Then he asked if she knew where his garage was. She said she would find it. He told her 9 o'clock the following morning. She arrived alone and on time. Carter was there when she pulled up, and he nodded at her once and went to the far end of the garage and stayed there. Giselle stood inside the open bay door and looked at the space the way someone looks at a room, that teaches them something about a person they thought they already understood. The whiteboard on the far wall was covered in equations written in different colors of marker, some crossed out, some circled, some connected with arrows that traveled to the edges of the board and wrapped around the corner. There was no decoration. There was a workbench covered in labeled components, a set of precision calipers hanging from a pegboard, and the F-150 parked neatly at the back. Owen was standing by the truck. He did not move toward her. He did not offer his hand. He waited. She asked him directly, standing just inside the door with her arms at her sides, whether his goal was to destroy NextDrive. Owen looked at her for a moment with an expression that was difficult to read because it contained something she had not expected. Not bitterness, not satisfaction, not anger. Just a kind of permanent steadiness, the expression of a man who had finished needing things from the outside world to feel level. He said his goal had always been to get this system into actual vehicles, driven by actual people, where the fuel efficiency numbers were not a lab artifact but a daily reality. He said if someone at NextDrive had done what he now suspected had been done, that was a problem between her and that person. It was not a problem between her and him. Giselle looked at the floor for a moment. Then she said she had laughed in his direction on camera in front of journalists. Owen said she had seen what she had been prepared to see. He said it without accusation. At the same temperature he said everything else. And somehow that flatness carried more weight than anger would have. Before she left, she asked one more question. She asked if his patent application had been filed. He said the application had been filed 14 months earlier and was currently under review. She looked at him once more, nodded once, and walked back to her car. She sat in the driver's seat for a moment before starting the engine. Then she called her attorney, not to discuss litigation against Owen, but to ask a precise question about the personal legal exposure of a senior officer who misrepresented the origins of intellectual property in an internal company submission. Her attorney told her it was a serious question. She said she knew. The NextDrive board completed its internal review in 31 days. The finding was not made public in full. What became known was a single line of corporate communication that appeared in the industry section of the financial press 6 weeks after the expo. Jason had departed NextDrive to pursue other opportunities. Readers of that particular formulation, and there were many in the industry who knew exactly what it meant, understood. No criminal referral was filed. The settlement terms, if there were any, were not disclosed. Jason disappeared from the professional visibility of the automotive engineering community in the way that people sometimes disappear when the alternative is worse. Quietly, with no press release, no farewell function, and no forwarding address given to colleagues. The United States Patent and Trademark Office approved Owen's patent application for the adaptive fuel distribution system 6 weeks after the TechVerify results were published. The approval notification arrived as a standard letter in his physical mailbox, the kind that comes in a plain windowed envelope with no outward indication of its significance. Carter printed it out at the library on Woodward Avenue and brought it back to the garage and taped it to the wall beside the whiteboard. Owen looked at it for a moment, said thank you, and went back to what he had been doing. NextDrive's formal contact came through a licensing inquiry filed by their legal department. It was professional, correctly structured, and arrived without any reference to the circumstances that had preceded it. Owen hired an intellectual property attorney, not the least expensive option he could find, and the two parties negotiated for 12 working days. Owen's 3 non-negotiable terms did not change across any of those 12 days: public attribution of the system's authorship in any implementation or marketing materials, a licensing structure rather than an outright assignment of rights, and an independent technical audit every 18 months to verify implementation fidelity. NextDrive's legal team pushed back on the first term twice and the third term once. Owen did not move on any of them. The contract was signed on a Thursday afternoon and filed before the business day closed. Giselle signed it in her office with the door open for the first time in several weeks. She read the attribution clause one more time before putting her pen down. The clause stated, plainly and permanently, that the fuel distribution architecture implemented in NextDrive's next-generation efficiency platform was developed by Owen and originated outside the company's internal programs. She had approved the clause herself. That was not the action of someone who had been defeated. It was the action of someone who had decided that the only thing worse than being wrong was continuing in the wrong direction after the evidence had arrived. Whether that represented growth or just pragmatism, she could not yet fully say. Perhaps it was both. Diana met Owen for dinner at a small place in Midtown that had no pretense about itself. The kind of restaurant where the menu was on a chalkboard and the tables were close enough together that you kept your voice at a natural level. She had not framed it as an interview request, and she had made that clear when she asked. He had said yes without deliberating. Over the course of an evening that lasted longer than either of them had planned, they talked about things that had nothing to do with patent filings or automotive engineering, or the particular shape that institutional betrayal takes when it has had 3 years to calcify into something productive. At one point, she asked him if he felt vindicated. He thought about the word for a moment and said it was not quite the right word. She asked what the right word was. He said he was not sure there was one, and that he was more interested in what came next than in what to call what had just happened. Carter asked him the same question in a different form, leaning against the workbench on a Saturday morning 2 weeks after the contract was signed. He asked what Owen was actually going to do next, now that the licensing money was coming. Owen told him he had been thinking about a second application. Not for passenger vehicles, but for light agricultural equipment, where a 40% reduction in fuel consumption was not a competitive advantage, but a material difference in whether a small-scale operation survived a bad harvest year or did not. Carter shook his head slowly and said Owen had just signed a licensing deal that would generate more money than either of them had seen in their professional lives, and he was sitting in a garage thinking about tractors. Owen looked at him and asked what was wrong with that. On the last night of that particular chapter, Owen stayed in the garage after Carter left. He stood in front of the whiteboard for a long time, looking at the equations that had accumulated there over 3 years. The wrong turns and the confirmed paths and the questions that had been answered and the ones that had answered themselves differently than expected. Then he took the eraser from its tray and cleared the board in long, even strokes, top to bottom. Not because the work was finished. Because there was only so much room on a whiteboard, and the next set of questions was already beginning to form at the edges of his thinking, and they needed space. He wrote the first of them in the upper left corner in blue marker and stepped back to look at it. The overhead bulb cast its familiar amber light across the concrete floor. Outside, the city made its usual sounds. Inside, there was the quiet of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and had already begun.